the past is prologue. That's part of what Howard Bloom is talking about tonight on Coast to Coast AM, and that is going back over the last, say, 400 years of capitalism, looking at the economic crises that every major empire faced, those strategic decision-making points in their history, those pivotal moments where they could have gone this way or that way. And what Howard is talking about is a repetition in the history of global economic engines that, without their knowing it, the decisions that they made, which turned their engines off, and then other people were able to rise in their wake. That is where we stand today, says Howard Bloom, and we'll be looking more at what he is telling us from his new book called The Rise of the Cup and Saucer, A Radical Reperception of Western Civilization, or Reinventing Capitalism, Putting Soul in the Machine. And we'll talk a little bit more about the crash here of 1929 and then how that informs us today. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What does Howard see that we're up to? And who is doing it right or wrong around the world? Who just might usurp us next on Coast to Coast AM? This is Ian Punnett. Very amazing insights, as always, with Howard Bloom on Coast to Coast AM. So here we were talking about capitalism at various times and those high benchmark successes of past empires, those times when they weren't even sure how high they were, that they thought that they were still in a place where they could keep on growing. They didn't realize that they had already peaked, and that because they didn't make good decisions after that, they never achieved their similar success in their future. We're talking about how we can avoid that, both as a country and individually. And Howard Bloom's been giving it a lot of thought and already put it in a book that's coming up. When is that book out, Howard?
The book, I'm embarrassed to say, the book is in draft form, available on my website, howardbloom.net. And we just entered negotiations with a publisher last week.
Okay, that's fine. It's real. I like the sample that you have on there at howardbloom.net, and you can link up to him through our website as well. So going back to 1873, Britain not realizing that their technologies that had made them dominant were now obsolete, and others were on the rise. Take us into the Great Depression of the early years of the 20th century in the United States.
Well,
and relate that back to what we've been talking about.
Okay, the Great Depression of 1929 is so spookily, so eerily like the one that we're having now that it's absolutely ridiculous. First, there was the great the stock market crash of 1929, but that wasn't the real depression. The real depression started in 1931, and it didn't start in the United States. It started in Austria. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Europe was still trying to stay on top of the world, and that included Germany, it included Britain. They were still trying to keep the old order together. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been divided up in the First World War, and Austro-Hungary was returning 10%. If you invested a dollar in Austria, the new Austro-Hungarian territory, you got 10 cents back in profits periodically, and it looked very good to you. So a lot of people were investing in Austria, but banks were shaky. This is before there was an FDIC, a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or anything like it around the world, insuring bank deposits. The Austrian government figured, okay, it's a big, modern, sophisticated time. We have telephones, we have typewriters, we have automobiles, they even had airplanes and commercial air travel in 1931. And we have the mathematics of Einstein, the mathematics of relativity, and we have the mathematics of quantum physics. So surely we can solve minor problems in a banking system. And when 5 of their banks got very quaky, very shaky, they figured, okay, we know exactly what to do. And they did something that we were doing with our banks a month ago. They made one of their big banks that was so big that its solidity was absolutely certain, absorb 5 of their smaller, weaker banks, knowing that this would shore up those 5 weaker banks forever. No more problems. 2 months later, the great big super bank called the government and said, well, we've just been going through our books and we've discovered something a little distressing. We're going through these huge losses. And the government said, fine, we know exactly what to do. This is a modern era. We, the government, will jump in and save you, which they did. But guess what went down next? The government went down next, trying to save the bank. A new government came in, but after it came into power, the shilling, the currency went down because foreigners had been investing very heavily in Austria, and when they saw all of this uncertainty, they all pulled their money out. So the Austrian currency was all of a sudden worth nothing. Fine, said the Germans next door. We're huge. We're enormous. We're fantastic. We invented modern physics. We invented Albert Einstein, and we invented quantum physics. We will invent our way out of the situation. We will come to your rescue. Guess who went down next? The Germans. The British said, we're not going to get involved in this at first, but once they saw it was too late, that they better damn well do something, the Britons jumped in along with the League of Nations and along with 135 central banks gathered in something called the Bank of International Settlements. In other words, these huge international organizations, very similar to the IMF and the organizations that are meeting this weekend to save us from our current credit collapse, jumped in. And it didn't do any good. Everybody turned to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It jumped in, and 10,000 out of America's 25,000 banks went down. So this was a domino effect. It took place all over the world. There was one country, Ian, that avoided all of this.
Who avoided the 1929 or then later the 1931 crash? Yeah.
It was a little country. Well, here's what it did, and then we'll figure out who it was. It was a little country whose leader had far more power. He didn't have to worry about democracies. He didn't have to worry. There's the old Eldridge Cleaver saying, the guy from the Black Panthers, if you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem.
Right.
Well, the problem in credit collapses like this is uncertainty, insecurity, fear. And if you can either telegraph one of two things if you're trying to solve a problem, it's not the solution that you come up with that counts, it's the way you do the solution. And either you telegraph with the way you do the solution, I'm absolutely confident that things are going solidly, or you telegraph that, oh my God, I'm scared to death. Those are your two options. Europe, with all of its heavy-duty maneuvers, with the League of Nations maneuver, with the International Settlement Bank maneuver, with the maneuvers of all the German banks and the British banks and the American banks, was doing it in such a dithering, back-and-forth way, taking so long to make up its mind, quibbling so much about the details. What do you think was telegraphing? Certainty and confidence, or uncertainty and insecurity? It was telegraphing uncertainty and insecurity. In this one country that avoided the credit collapse, the leader, again, did not have to go through the democratic process. He did not have to lay his quibbling out in public. He simply went behind the scenes in total secrecy to the heads of his largest banks and said, okay, you guys, I know you're in trouble. I'm going to pump all the government money you need into you to support you. All I ask from you is this. Do not show a single sign of fear or uncertainty. You must look through all of this as if nothing can faze you. Not a thing can ruffle your feathers. Not a thing can ruffle your hair. You are coming out of this like 007, coming up out of the sea with a perfectly pressed tuxedo and absolutely the right haircut. And sure enough, they did. And when people were pulling their money out of the banks of Germany and England and the United States and wondered where they were going to put their money, is there a place better than a mattress? They all went to this little tiny country and put their money there. And that little tiny country was Italy. And the guy who managed to pull off this trick was Benito Mussolini. Not a nice man. Not a person I would ever recommend in a pinch. But he pulled off magic. That's what you were talking about before. Perception, emotion, and magic.
The prestige.
They pulled off the confidence, the feeling that there was tremendous solidity. There was nothing to worry about. There was no uncertainty. There was no insecurity. Everything was perfect. That's the illusion that that Benito Mussolini pulled off. It was magic, it was perception, it was emotion. And when you go through these massive crashes, these are spasms in mass emotion. We humans don't just have individual moods. We have mass moods. We have group moods. We have crowd moods. And those moods go from tremendous ebullience, being confident that we can accomplish absolutely anything, which is what the world went through, what Europe went through when World War I was declared. Everybody went to war with picnic baskets. The women and children all showed up with picnic baskets because they were sure that war was going to be over in 5 weeks and they were going to win.
Right.
In the Civil War, the northern wives and kids also went to the battle lines with picnic baskets. They were sure this would take a week. That's mass ebullience. But that's
irrational exuberance, maybe we would.
Irrational exuberance. It's mass. It is mass manic. It's the mass manic phase. But manic depressives go through two phases: mania and depression. And manic mass depression, a spasm of manic mass depression, is what we call a credit collapse, or these days a credit crunch. And what used to be called, with a more accurate term because it's a more emotional term, what used to be called a panic. Panics are spasms in mass emotion.
And they're often self-fulfilling. I mean, there may not have been anything to panic about at the beginning, didn't prevent somebody from actually panicking, and then by the time that becomes contagious and is passed on from one cell group to another, then you do actually have an epidemic of panic, and then the panic then it becomes real.
You're absolutely right. The panic becomes real because perception becomes reality if enough people believe in it.
Have you read the book The Forgotten Man by Amity Shlaes?
No, what is it?
Okay, it's a New York Times bestseller. I think you'd find it fascinating. It's all about it's a re-examination of the Depression, and I've been reading it last 3 or 4 days, and it's a lot about how it was neither Hoover, Hoover wasn't wearing the little devil suit, FDR wasn't wearing angel wings and a halo. That there are lots of things that FDR did, which actually perpetuated the Depression in the United States.
Right.
He didn't mean to. He wasn't trying to, perhaps. But his power was coming from the Depression, and in solving it, or in attempting to solve it, he actually kept capital investors from getting back into the markets again for quite some time, at least until the war came along and helped to break that up.
Right. Well, now, one thing that wars have in common, there are a couple of things that wars have in common with these massive panics. They're both paroxysms, they're both spasms in a manic depressive cycle. They both happen in part or sometimes because of domino effects. If we go back to 1932 and the credit collapse of 1932, first credit Anstalt in Austria began to go down. It reached out a hand to its rescuer, the Austrian government. The Austrian government went down. The Austrian government reached out a hand to the German banks. The German banks began to go down, and so on and so forth. World War I was very much the same place, and ironically, it started in exactly the same place, in Austro-Hungary, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A Serbian who was a member of a group called Young Bosnia shot an heir apparent to an imperial throne that very few people had ever heard of. His name was Franz Ferdinand. The Austro-Hungarians felt, we can't have this going on in our republic, and they issued an ultimatum to Serbia. The Serbians were allies with Russia and turned to Russia, and Russia said, we can't have this happening in our sphere of influence. And they announced that they were mobilizing their army. Now, that's a very big move. That means mobilizing 1 million men and sending them to the front as rapidly as possible by rail or trunk, complete with all the weapons necessary to make war. And in response to that, France mobilized its people. Then Germany mobilized its army. Then Germany marched across Belgium, and because England was allied with Belgium, England had to jump in. In other words, it was a massive domino effect. Now, let's take a small detour for a second. First of all, one of the things that we're overlooking these days, because we're so preoccupied with this credit collapse, is we've set ourselves up for 2 domino effects. Domino effect number 1, a worldwide credit collapse. That we can't help. because banking systems have been so interconnected that in 1873, global credit collapses were happening. But we've also set ourselves up for World War III. Now, that sounds pretty improbable. How could we possibly have done that? Well, did you notice that about February of 2008, we recognized the independence of a little country called Kosovo? And what I noticed about that was nobody bothered to ask why. And nobody bothered to ask what the implications were. Even the PBS NewsHour, which examines all of the major issues of the day in tremendous and painstaking detail, didn't stop to even ask why we had done that. Well, Kosovo, declaring our support for the independence of Kosovo and then pushing for Kosovo to be part of NATO, that is the equivalent to Russia recognizing the independence of Washington, D.C., based on the fact that 80% of Washington, D.C. citizens are black, therefore it shouldn't be a part of the United States of America, and then offering a military alliance to Washington. And then we set up another alliance of this sort with Georgia. Well, Georgia is where Stalin was born and raised. Like Kosovo, Georgia is right on the border with Russia. And we've been talking about bringing Georgia into NATO. And we've been talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. What we don't recognize is what started World War I was a set of what were called entangling alliances, a set of alliances where one little country went over, just one little archduke was shot, and it started toppling the dominoes all across the face of Europe. Ian, you still there?
Am I still there? I'm riveted. You said you had two domino chains going, so that's the first one. I'm just waiting for the second one.
Well, one of them is 1931 and the credit collapse. And that went from domino to domino to domino, from Austria to Germany, from Germany to England, from England to the United States. And in this case, World War I, we had domino after domino after domino, and now we've set up Kosovo and Georgia and the Ukraine. Sarah Palin, 2 weeks ago, said, we absolutely must bring Georgia and the Ukraine into NATO. Ian, NATO's a military alliance. Well, that's like the Russians saying, we absolutely must bring Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the bridge from Detroit, and Tijuana, Mexico, which is right across the border from California and Arizona, if my geography is at all correct. That's like Russia saying, we have to bring these into a Russian-based strategic alliance. Now, once upon a time, here's what happened.
No, hang on then. That's where you got to hang on. We'll be back for the rest of Once Upon a Time in just a second. It's Howard Bloom. And I want to get to that other – I want to explore both of those domino chains coming up right after this. How could world events lead us right into World War III from this economic downturn we're experiencing right now? Howard Bloom explains on Coast to Coast AM. Well, we've got so much going on, actually, on this show, so we'll get back to it right away. Howard Bloom has a new book he's putting the finishing touches on called The Rise of the Cup and Saucer. It affects directly the conversation, I think, that has been going on in the country the last 6 or 7 days, is when can you tell we're in a depression? When can you tell what is a recession? What is a correctable? What is the next move to make? And Howard Bloom is talking about some of the stakes that we are facing right now if we don't make good decisions based on what has happened in the past. Mussolini got it right, he says, at least on the subject of the economic collapse that was facing that Europe was facing, and prevented it from happening in Italy. I want to go back and explore more of that, too, and how the events of today could be leading to World War III a lot faster than any of us would like to think. Next, on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. I want to make sure we leave time before the top of the hour to go back to the solar collectors in space as being the next big technology, as you see it, Howard Bloom. But we were just talking about the dominoes of World War III and what would happen if we had our sort of mingled alliances. What would happen if one thing Russia did brought us to having to defend somebody like Kosovo or Georgia? So go ahead and finish that thought.
Well, Sarah Palin, about 2 to 3 weeks ago, said that she believed with all her heart that we should be supporting Georgia and the Ukraine in becoming members of NATO. That's really entangling alliances to the nth degree, and it goes back to what you said at the very beginning of the program, which is those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it, except we cannot afford to be doomed to repeat this particular history. Because Sarah Palin also said that if that brought on war with Russia, and if Russia invaded Georgia over that and led to war with the United States, so be it, bring it on. I'm sorry, it's not that easy, Sarah. Sarah forgets that the kids of the 1950s and the 1960s were raised in the shadow of mutually assured destruction. They were raised to cower under their desks with their hands over their head while a nuclear bomb wiped out their entire city, not to mention their hands and their heads.
Right. I mean, there was no way of surviving that.
Right. And basically the Russians still have all of those interballistic missiles. They still have all of those nuclear warheads, and you don't want to trigger another domino effect. And once upon a time, in diplomacy for a long, long time, there has been an automatic way to make another country start a war with you. Once upon a time in 1871, Otto von Bismarck, who was running Prussia, wanted to make war. He wanted France to declare war on him, because he knew that for every one guy that the French could muster up, he could muster 4, and he knew that even though the French had these brand-new things called needle guns and these brand-new things called mitrailleuses, machine guns, he had cannons that could fire a mile further than anything the French could muster, meaning he could chop the French up like chicken liver before they could get anywhere near even being able to fire a shot at him. So he wanted the French to declare war on him so he would have the moral advantage. How did he manage to get the French to declare war on him? He did something called encirclement. He was on one side of France, he was on the east side, and the Spanish needed to find a new king. So he started using secret negotiations to shove a German onto the throne of Spain. Now, with Germany on both the east and west side, France had no choice but to declare war. Well, we're pulling encirclement on Russia. And that's why I say that this is the equivalent to Russia declaring strategic military alliances with Windsor, Ontario, and with Tijuana, Mexico. We would not be able to stand for that for a minute. Look what we did just over a tiny little speck of land, Cuba, going into the Russian sphere of influence in 1961. So Sarah has forgotten her history. And if she doesn't remember it, and she becomes vice president, and she's a spunky little person, and there's much to admire about her, then we could be in a great deal of trouble. And there's something that wars and that massive tsunami-size worldwide credit collapses, the ones that lead to depressions, have in common. They're shakeouts. They are shakeouts that prove who the winners are and who the losers are. And they're like shakeouts that show those who are disguised as winners for the moment, but who don't really deserve to be up there. And they end up on the bottom when the shakeout is over. Now, for America, what's the answer? What do we do next? We demonstrate that we belong up there with the winners and not down at the bottom of the box with the losers. And how do we do it? First, in 2 ways. Way number 1 is we have to be on top of the technology of the next 100 years. It's not enough to have been on top of the technologies of the last 100 years. That 100 years is behind us. The only thing we have ahead of us is the future. So unless we own the high ground of the future, unless we are right there on top of the new frontiers of the future, we are not going to make it into the next 70 years. We're not going to be on top in the next 70 years. And believe me, if we're not on top anymore, we're not going to like the position we're in, because everybody hates us right now. Everybody.
Okay. Yeah, but to go back to your Sarah Palin comment, I don't think John McCain shares her exact point of view, nor does he have the stomach, it would seem, for engaging in war as easily as Sarah Palin talked about it. I think John McCain is often, with his, the perspective of a weazened soldier, he's reluctant to commit other mothers' sons to battle.
I would suspect you're right, only because now that I've become very involved in the space movement, a great many of my friends are military friends, and these are some of the most honorable people I know, and they are some of the most anti-war people I've ever met in my life.
If you've seen it, you never want to see it again.
Right, exactly. Right. So hopefully, and also, John McCain won my respect 10 years ago when he began to take on the politicians, the central figures in his own party, and showed that he was willing to be independent in a way that no other politician in my time has been independent. But he has also declared his strong support for Georgia. And I don't know where he stands on the Ukraine. Remember, the Ukraine is where a city named Kiev was born. Kiev is where a bunch of Viking princes began to set up a new empire of their own. And it was called the Empire of the Red-Headed Ones because the Vikings had blonde and red hair. And we know that Empire of the Red-Headed Ones as the Rus. In other words, Russia was born in what we now call the Ukraine. Russia's central historical city is in what we now call the Ukraine. And we're talking about making that a part of NATO. Again, those who don't remember their history are doomed to repeat it.
Okay, so how do you anticipate, I mean, if you had to lay out a scenario for how World War III would start, and keeping in mind the same things, what we're trying to do to prevent further economic collapse,
right?
How do those two things intermingle to form World War III?
Well, okay, first of all, I would absolutely recognize that you don't get rude to your neighbors. You know how when you're at a party, if somebody's at the polite distance from you, about 1.5 to 2 feet, you're fine. But if somebody practically has his hair on your cheek, you get a little uncomfortable. You've come a little too close. We have to be polite to Russia. We have to treat them the way that we would want them to treat us, which means we would not want them to have strategic alliances or military alliances with Tijuana and Windsor, Ontario. So we can't do the same thing with them either. We have to recognize that we can't nudge them, push them, shove them, crowd them out. That's what we have to do when it comes to war, and we have to take a little time out from all of our concerns about the world collapse, the credit system collapsing, to pay attention to being nice to Russia, at least just being polite to Russia. When it comes to the credit collapses, it's shock and awe because a credit collapse is all about perception and all about mass emotion. It has to be solved with shock therapies. It has to be solved with magic. It has to be solved with perceptual games. And the Irish, for example, we've been diddling around. We've talked about huge numbers in the trillions to save the banking systems of the world. Approximately $2 trillion have been talked about so far in order to save the banking systems of the world. But it's been diddled out and tiddled out and pushed out in little tiny piffles and whiffles. And all the insecurity in the world has been telegraphed around it. Oh, we have to discuss that. Oh, we have to discuss that, the other thing. The dithering has been incredible. And remember, all people register is how you do it, not what you do, whether you do it with certainty or whether you do it with dithering. If you do it with dithering, it doesn't matter what you do. The effect is wasted. The world is already panicked with uncertainty. And all you've done is added more uncertainty to the gross emotional condition of the world. So we have to move fast. In Ireland was one of the first countries to begin to shake and shudder in the current financial panic, in the current financial collapse. Well, the head of finance for Ireland, the chief financial minister for Ireland, solved the problem on a Monday night. He said, we are going to extend FDIC-style guarantees for every deposit in every Irish-owned bank. As of now, this minute, he didn't dither, he didn't dally, he didn't discuss, he did it. And that's how he managed to save the Irish banks. $14 billion have gone into Irish banks in the last 4 weeks at a time when billions and billions and billions of dollars have been coming out of American banks, out of English banks, out of French banks, out of German banks. You do things decisively.
So you would recommend the U.S. government buying stakes in U.S. banks?
Yes, I think it's a good idea, but it isn't. Remember, Ian, it isn't so much what you do; it's how you do it.
Okay, and do it decisively. Do it with
decisively. Confidence.
Don't appear like you're weak doing it. We have to create illusions at this point.
Absolutely.
We need them, and we're ready for them. We're an audience that's waiting to be amazed by what the players on the stage can do.
You've got it. It's the shock and awe factor. It's the wow and wallop factor. It's the wow factor we need right now.
Okay, very interesting. Now, this solar technology, solar space technology. Talk about that. Why is that the next new technology, and who is poised to be ready to start turning solar power from space into electricity here on Earth?
It's the new technology because America, since 1961, when John Kennedy said a couple of things that some leader has to say right now, even if that leader is you and me, and that is, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country right now. In other words, we're all in this together, we're all going to pull together, we're all going to make it to the other side. No matter what it takes, we are going to make it to the other side. And he said, I'm asking you to do this arbitrary thing, going to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. We have no illusion that this will be easy, but we are doing it because of the benefits that you get from doing the really difficult. Well, ever since then, we have had all of the equipment necessary to be in space on a regular basis. We have more advanced rockets with more lifting capacity than any other country on the face of the Earth, with the exception of Russia. Russia also has the kind of capacity that we do. Look at what we've done with the shuttle. Look, we have an International Space Station up there. Are we using it for anything? No. Is it because it's useless? No. It's because of a failure of imagination. That's all. And what makes new frontiers out of old emptinesses, out of impossible deserts, is imagination. Ian, it's imagination.
Could you turn the space station into a solar power plantation?
You could turn it into the beginning of that because you could begin assembling stuff like crazy. There's a guy in the space community named Dennis Wingo, and Dennis Wingo is absolutely brilliant. And if you sit down for a half an hour with Dennis Wingo, he will fill you with so many commercializable ideas for this already existing International Space Station that it will set your head spinning. But nobody at NASA is listening to Dennis, even though Dennis is way up there in the space community, and he's absolutely brilliant. He's just astonishing. Now, Buzz Aldrin listens to Dennis. The people I know in the space community who are very high placed listen to him. But the most important thing is we have all these existing rockets. We could be mass producing them. We're talking about building entirely new forms of rockets, throwing away the old ones without ever getting to the point. You know, once you produce when you produce one copy of something, it costs a fortune. When you produce 100 copies, that divides the fortune by 100 and makes it less expensive. When you produce 1 million copies, all of a sudden it's very inexpensive. Well, we've never gotten to the point of economies of scale with all these rockets that we have been producing ever since the 1960s. And we can use them to put up all the materials we need to build huge solar arrays in space. The technology to beam the energy down to Earth. It's simple radio wave technology, like the waves that travel to and from your cell phone. Those are microwaves. Those are simple radio waves. And the technology for beaming electricity using these microwaves or radio waves has been in existence since the 1960s.
Now,
all we have to do is pull it out of a closet.
Is anybody other than us poised to put up these panels and collect solar power from space and beam it back down to Earth?
Russia could do it, and India could do it. But India and China could do it. But for India and China, it would take a long time because they haven't had China has just had its first men in space, and just for very short periods of time. Russia's had men in space longer than any other country on the face of the Earth. So Russia is ready to do it. We are ready to do it, but we make solar panels. And I do not know if Russia does. We have a lead right now, and we're letting it lapse because of a failure of imagination. And it's time for us to take advantage of it while we have it and to push it to the max.
Now, there are examples from history of empires that were seemingly on the brink of handing over the baton of technological superiority to another country, like, as you said, England in 1873, not realizing that they had peaked with all of their industries that had made them great, weren't going to continue to make them great. Are there examples from history of countries that were able to essentially hand the baton back to themselves?
Well, I'll give you I'll give you an example of that. England was really never all that powerful until the 19th century. And one of the reasons England was not all that powerful was because England had no imagination. England had no sense of where to open up a new frontier. All it could do was try to eke out portions of material in old frontiers. So what did it do? There was a thing called the 100 Years' War. What was the 100 Years' War about? England wanted a piece of Europe. After all, Europe was the only thing that counted, right?
Right.
Europe was the only place where people were rich. Now, it's true that North America and South America had already been discovered, but at least by the time some of these wars were going on. But as far as as far as England was concerned, I'm sorry, those are barren territories. South America, the Spanish already have it. That's where all the easy gold is. North America, are you kidding? North America's empty. There's nothing there. Trees, Indians, give me a break. Where's the gold? So England kept making war with France to get a piece of Europe. And in Europe was so impoverished by so many people trying to get a piece of Europe that when English travelers went on trips into Italy, they wondered why there were no songbirds singing in the morning. And there were no songbirds singing in the morning because the Italians had eaten the songbird off of every tree. Instead, eventually England was forced to look at North America, this empty, barren land, just as empty and barren as space looks to us today. And that's where it made its fortune. The best thing that ever happened to England was the fact that it wasn't able to win a territory in Europe, that it lost every one of those wars, those 100-year wars with France, and finally was forced to turn its attention to the emptiness, to the barrens, to the terribly empty territories, and It was forced to wake up its imagination and see the new frontier in this emptiness, and that's what we have to do with space.
Well, whenever I talk with Howard Bloom, I always feel like I am Sherman to his Mr. Peabody. So I'm looking forward to there being some company on the Sherman bench. We'll open up the phones coming up next, and you too can ask Howard Bloom whatever you need to know about the current state we're in and what he sees by studying history on getting out of it successfully, World War III possibilities, and the history of economic collapses, the people that saved them and the people that caused them coming up next. Your questions and comments for Howard Bloom on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett.